On July 28, 2016, the air inside the Wells Fargo Center in Philadelphia was thick with the weight of nearly 2.5 centuries of anticipation. As thousands of delegates cheered, a single figure stood at the podium, silhouetted against a backdrop of history. For the first time in the existence of the United States, a woman, Hillary Clinton, accepted the presidential nomination of a major political party. It was a moment described not just as a political victory, but as a definitive crack in the ultimate glass ceiling. But that crack did not appear in a vacuum. It was the result of a slow, rhythmic pounding by the hammers of dozens of women who had come before her. This is the story of the milestones, the failures, and the radical courage of 7 women who refused to believe that their place was anywhere but in the halls of power. The date was July 28, 2016, a day that served as the culmination of centuries of struggle and a beacon for the future of American politics. Within the Democratic National Convention, the atmosphere was electric, charged by the realization that history was no longer a distant goal, but a present reality. Hillary Clinton ascended to the stage to become the first female presidential candidate of a major U.S. political party, a feat that had eluded every woman since the founding of the Republic. While the subsequent November election would not result in her gaining the presidency, the nomination itself was hailed as a tectonic shift in the American landscape. It was the moment the ultimate glass ceiling saw its most significant fracture yet, a development that was only possible because of the persistent, often grueling work of the women who had spent decades chipping away at the barriers of the status quo. To understand the gravity of 2016, one must look back at the dozens of women who formed those initial cracks, those who ran when they couldn't vote, and those who led when they weren't welcome. Clinton's nomination was more than just a personal achievement. It was a symbolic victory for a movement that had been building momentum since before the Civil War. Her presence at the top of a major party ticket validated the efforts of reformers, suffragists, and early female politicians who had often been dismissed as eccentric or peripheral. By securing the nomination, Clinton moved the conversation of female leadership from the margins of minority parties to the very center of the American executive branch. This moment served as a mirror reflecting the progress made across the House, the Senate, and the governor's mansions. As the delegates looked on, they weren't just seeing a candidate. They were seeing the legacy of every woman who had ever dared to assert her right to lead. This chapter of American history was not an isolated event, but the latest milestone in a series of 7 distinct breakthroughs that redefined what was possible for women in the United States. 50 years before the 19th Amendment would finally grant women across the United States the legal right to cast a ballot, a woman named Victoria Woodhull decided she would not wait for permission to lead the nation. Woodhull was a figure of immense complexity and undeniable drive, a stockbroker, a newspaper publisher, and an unapologetic champion of social reform. Her background was as colorful as it was controversial. She had once been a traveling fortune teller, a factor detractors frequently used to label her as an eccentric or a fraud. However, Woodhull was far more than her reputation suggested. She was a visionary who recognized that the right to vote was inextricably linked to the right to hold office. In a bold act of political theater and genuine conviction, she declared her candidacy for the presidency of the United States, challenging the very foundations of a male-dominated society that viewed women as legal dependents rather than sovereign citizens. Woodhull's entrance into the political arena was a shock to the system of the 1870s. Her outspoken support for female suffrage and her radical views on social equality earned her both intense national attention and the nomination of the short-lived Equal Rights Party in 1872. She was a woman who occupied spaces where women were traditionally forbidden, the floor of the stock exchange and the editorial desks of a newspaper, and she used those platforms to broadcast her message of total emancipation. While the established political elite viewed her as a curiosity or a threat, she became a focal point for the early suffrage movement, proving that a woman could not only imagine herself in the White House, but could organize a formal campaign to get there. Her candidacy was the first true crack in the ceiling, a radical assertion that a woman's place was wherever she chose to stand, even if the law had not yet caught up to her ambition. The presidential contest of 1872 was a grueling test for Victoria Woodhull, and it highlighted the immense barriers facing women in the 19th century. Despite her relentless campaigning and the fervor of her supporters in the Equal Rights Party, the path to the presidency was blocked by more than just tradition. It was blocked by a legal and social framework that refused to recognize her legitimacy. Woodhull's campaign was a whirlwind of social reform rhetoric, but when the dust settled, she did not receive any electoral votes. The contest was won decisively by the incumbent, Ulysses S. Grant, leaving Woodhull's bid as a symbolic rather than a functional victory. However, the failure to secure the office did not equate to a failure of the mission. Woodhull had successfully forced the issue of female leadership into the national consciousness, creating a precedent that would be followed by other notable women like Belva Lockwood, and much later, Margaret Chase Smith and Shirley Chisholm. Woodhull's legacy is defined by the sheer audacity of her attempt during an era when women were still decades away from basic enfranchisement. Her campaign served as a psychological breakthrough for the suffrage movement, demonstrating that the pursuit of the highest office in the land was a legitimate tool for social change. By running for president, she exposed the hypocrisy of a democracy that excluded half of its population from the democratic process. Although her name faded from the immediate political headlines following the 1872 election, the path she blazed remained open for those who would follow. Each subsequent female candidate who stepped onto the national stage owed a debt to Woodhull's eccentric courage. She proved that the first step toward breaking a ceiling is having the nerve to reach for it, setting the stage for the legislative and executive breakthroughs that would eventually follow in the 20th century. As the movement for women's rights gained legal ground in individual states, the focus shifted from the presidency to the halls of Congress. Jeannette Rankin, a native of Montana and a tireless activist, became the face of this new era. Long before the 19th Amendment was ratified, Rankin was working as the legislative secretary of the National American Woman Suffrage Association. Her strategic mind and relentless advocacy were instrumental in gaining Montana women the right to vote in 1914. This local victory was the springboard for her own political career. In 1916, 2 years after her state's enfranchisement, the people of Montana made history by electing Rankin to the U.S. House of Representatives. She was the first woman to ever hold a seat in Congress, arriving in Washington, D.C., not just as a representative of her district, but as a representative of her entire gender's potential. Rankin's tenure in Congress was marked by a steadfast commitment to her personal and political principles, most notably her lifelong pacifism. While her role as a female pioneer was historic, her congressional legacy was equally defined by her courage to stand alone on matters of war and peace. She holds the unique and profound distinction of being the only member of Congress to vote against U.S. involvement in both World War I and World War II. Her first term and her second term were bookended by these monumental decisions, proving that she was not merely a symbolic figurehead, but a legislator of immense conviction. Following Rankin's breakthrough, the number of women in Congress began a slow but steady climb. This trajectory eventually led to another major milestone in 2007, when Nancy Pelosi was sworn in as the first female Speaker of the House, completing the journey from Rankin's lone voice to a woman holding the gavel of leadership. While the House of Representatives saw its first woman in 1916, the U.S. Senate, often called the world's most exclusive club, remained a male bastion for slightly longer. The transition began with a symbolic gesture in 1922, when Rebecca Felton of Georgia was appointed to fill her late husband's seat. At 87 years old, Felton served for only 2 days, a move by the Georgia governor to honor her commitment to women's rights and to appeal to the newly enfranchised female electorate. However, the true breakthrough for the Senate came in 1931 with Hattie Caraway of Arkansas. Like Felton, Caraway was initially appointed to her husband's seat following his death. But unlike those before her, Caraway sought to prove she belonged in the chamber on her own merits. She won a special election to carry out the remainder of her husband's term. And then she did something even more significant. She ran for re-election and won, not once, but twice. Hattie Caraway was far more than a placeholder. She became a reliable and influential supporter of President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal legislation. Her presence in the Senate proved that a woman could navigate the complexities of upper chamber politics and maintain the support of her constituents over multiple terms. Despite her success, the path she cleared was slow to fill. For decades, only a few women followed in her footsteps, and the Senate remained overwhelmingly male. It wasn't until 1992, famously dubbed the Year of the Woman, that the chamber saw a significant shift. In that single election cycle, 4 women, Barbara Boxer, Carol Moseley Braun, Dianne Feinstein, and Patty Murray, were elected, tripling the number of women in the Senate at once. Caraway's legacy was the foundation upon which this modern surge was built, proving that the Senate was not just a place for men, but a place where women could exert lasting legislative influence. The executive branch at the state level provided another frontier for female leadership, and once again, the breakthrough came from the West. Nellie Tayloe Ross made history in November 1924 when she was elected governor of Wyoming, becoming the first woman to lead a U.S. state. The circumstances of her rise were rooted in tragedy, as she was elected to fill the vacancy left by her husband, William Ross, who had died suddenly just weeks earlier. However, the setting for this milestone was perfectly appropriate. Wyoming had been the first state in the Union to allow women full voting rights, long before the National Amendment. Ross's election was a natural extension of Wyoming's progressive history, and though she lost her bid for re-election in 1926, her political career was far from over. Her competence and leadership caught the attention of the national stage, leading to a decades-long career in federal service. In 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt appointed Nellie Tayloe Ross as the director of the U.S. Mint, a position she held with distinction for 20 years. Her success paved the way for others. Just 15 days after Ross took office in Wyoming, Ma Ferguson was sworn in as governor of Texas. However, these early female governors shared a commonality. They were both preceded in office by their husbands. The next major leap in state-level executive power didn't occur until 1974, when Ella Grasso was elected governor of Connecticut. Grasso's victory was a landmark moment because she was the first woman to rise to a state's highest office without having been preceded by a spouse. From Ross to Grasso, the evolution of the female governor showed a transition from filling a family void to winning executive power on the strength of an independent political identity, proving that women could manage the complex machinery of state government. The inauguration of Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1933 marked a turning point for women in the federal executive branch. While Nellie Tayloe Ross was taking charge of the U.S. Mint, another woman was about to become one of the most influential figures in American history. Frances Perkins was appointed as Roosevelt's Secretary of Labor, making her the first woman to serve in a presidential cabinet. Perkins did not come to the role as a political favor. She was a seasoned veteran of the fight for workers' rights and safety, having served in various New York City and state agencies. She had witnessed firsthand the struggles of the working class and was determined to use her federal position to enact systemic change. As one of only 2 cabinet members to serve for the entirety of the Roosevelt administration from 1933 to 1945, she became a cornerstone of the American government during its most transformative era. Perkins's impact on American life is difficult to overstate. She played an active and central role in developing and enacting the New Deal programs that redefined the social contract between the government and its citizens. She was a primary architect of the Social Security Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act, pieces of legislation that continue to protect millions of Americans today. Her tenure proved that a woman could not only manage a massive federal department, but could also lead the way in creating monumental policy shifts. Perkins's success at the cabinet level opened the door for future generations of women to lead the nation's most critical departments. This lineage includes Jeannette, who became the first female Attorney General, and Madeleine Albright, the first female Secretary of State. Frances Perkins was the proof of concept that a woman's intellect and empathy were essential tools for high-level governance and national stability. For nearly 2 centuries, the Supreme Court of the United States was an exclusively male institution, a final barrier that seemed impenetrable. That changed during the 1980 presidential campaign when Ronald Reagan made a bold promise. If elected, he would name a woman to the nation's highest court. In 1981, Reagan fulfilled that vow by nominating Sandra Day O'Connor, a judge from the Arizona Court of Appeals, to fill the vacancy left by Justice Potter Stewart. The significance of the moment was reflected in her Senate confirmation, which was unanimous. O'Connor stepped onto the bench, not just as a pioneer, but as a formidable legal mind who would spend the next 25 years shaping American jurisprudence. She frequently found herself as the swing vote on landmark cases, making her one of the most powerful individuals in the country, regardless of gender. O'Connor's presence on the court fundamentally altered its dynamic and the way the law was perceived. For years, she was the lone female voice, a position she handled with grace and ironclad resolve. When Ruth Bader Ginsburg joined the court in 1993, O'Connor famously remarked that she was so glad to have company. The two women, though often differing in their judicial philosophies, shared the unique burden and honor of representing their gender at the pinnacle of the legal system. When O'Connor retired in 2006, Ginsburg noted a sense of loneliness on the bench, but that void was soon filled. In 2009, Sonia Sotomayor was seated, followed by Elena Kagan in 2010. Sandra Day O'Connor had done more than just sit on the court. She had normalized the presence of women in the judiciary, ensuring that the highest court in the land would eventually reflect the diversity of the people it served. By the 1980s, women had been appearing on presidential tickets for over a century, but they had always been relegated to minor parties with no realistic path to the White House. That changed in 1984 when Walter Mondale, the Democratic presidential candidate, made a strategic and historic choice. Seeking to inject energy and excitement into his campaign, Mondale selected Geraldine Ferraro, a congresswoman from New York, as his running mate. Ferraro was a sharp, experienced politician who had risen through the ranks of the House, and her selection was a watershed moment for major party politics. While other names like Dianne Feinstein were considered, Ferraro became the first woman to run for vice president on a major party ticket, bringing the prospect of a female executive closer to reality than ever before. The 1984 campaign was an uphill battle, and ultimately, Mondale and Ferraro were soundly defeated by the incumbent, Ronald Reagan. Ferraro left Congress following the election, and, despite 2 bids for the Senate in the 1990s, she never again held elected office. However, the impact of her candidacy resonated far beyond the election results. She had shattered the perception that a woman could not handle the scrutiny and pressure of a national executive campaign. Her run proved that the American electorate was ready to see a woman on the ballot for the second highest office in the land. Ferraro's breakthrough remained the only one of its kind for decades, until Sarah Palin became the Republican vice presidential nominee in 2008. Her courage in 1984 served as the bridge between the early pioneers like Woodhull and the modern reality of Hillary Clinton's 2016 nomination, proving that every loss in history is also a brick in the path toward future victory. As we look back at the timeline of these 7 firsts, we see a narrative of relentless progression. From Victoria Woodhull's radical bid in 1872 to Hillary Clinton's major party nomination in 2016, the story of women in U.S. politics is not just about individuals, but about a collective movement to redefine the American identity. Each woman, Rankin in the House, Caraway in the Senate, Ross in the governor's mansion, Perkins in the cabinet, O'Connor on the court, and Ferraro on the ticket, added a new layer of legitimacy and possibility to the role of women in leadership. They proved that a woman's place is indeed in the House, the Senate, and every other hall of power where decisions are made. These milestones were not ends in themselves, but catalysts that empowered the next generation to aim even higher, ensuring that the firsts would eventually become common, and then the standard. The glass ceiling that Hillary Clinton spoke of in 2016 still bears the marks of these 7 pioneers. While the ultimate goal of the presidency remained just out of reach in that moment, the infrastructure for a future victory was firmly established. The journey from being an eccentric candidate to a major party nominee took 144 years, a span of time filled with both symbolic gestures and substantive policy achievements. The story of these women reminds us that progress is often slow and nonlinear, but it is also inevitable when driven by those who refuse to accept the limits placed upon them. As new names continue to be added to the list of political firsts, they do so on the shoulders of the stockbrokers, the pacifists, the widows who became leaders, and the judges who held the balance of justice. The cracks in the ceiling are now too many to count, and the light of a new era is finally breaking through.